right, good evening. We have been interested in the sky ever since recorded history. Originally, our interest was due to the fact we needed a calendar of some sort, and the sun and the moon provided ways to determine months and years. Interestingly, the patterns that we see in the sky, the constellations, also became important not just through mythological stories, but through practicality. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon, the nursery rhyme. It's talking about constellations in the night sky. The cat being Leo the lion, the fiddle being Lyra, it's a summer constellation. And when the English would see all the constellations mentioned in that nursery rhyme, it told them it's springtime, at the full moon, it's time to plant the crops. And that way they didn't plant crops so early that they would possibly freeze when they were just starting to sprout. Also, it meant they planted early enough that they wouldn't freeze in the autumn before it was time to harvest. So the people of medieval and ancient times were much more in tune with the night sky than we are today. There have been some interesting events in astronomy, though, that changed possibly the way history is unfolded. Comets are a good example. The picture to the upper one, let's see, I believe there is yes. This is Hale-Bopp. It was the last of what we call the great comets to have graced our skies. It came by in the spring of 1997 and put on a beautiful display. But of course, the most famous is probably Halley's Comet. There we go. Halley's Comet has been making the circuit of the inner solar system for a very long time. It was recorded on the famous Bayeux Tapestry that talked about the last time Britain was conquered from the continent of Europe. William the Conqueror was claiming the throne of England. His uncle had actually been the previous king, but the king's brother-in-law was Harold, and he claimed the throne. And so after some skirmishes, William decided to invade Britain. There was a comet that became very prominent at the time. This is part of the Bayeux Tapestry, and you see people here that are pointing to this. And since it wasn't very clear, here it is enlarged. And this was seen as an omen. For some, they thought it meant victory. Others were scared it meant they weren't going to do so well. And so when King Harold was overthrown and William the Conqueror conquered England, it was blamed on this celestial visitor. This turned out to be Halley's Comet. In order to make sure that this comet did not cause any more problems in Europe, the Pope had it excommunicated. Didn't do any good. It keeps coming back every 75 to 76 years. Julius Caesar adopted a son named Octavian, and this was one of the younger sons, and he wasn't considered very powerful, probably because of his age and inexperience, but he turned out to be quite shrewd. When Caesar's assassination occurred in 44 BC, they arranged to have a funeral, which was several days, close to a week, I think, in length. And during that time, a comet happened to appear in the sky. It was a very bright comet, and people thought this meant that the soul of Caesar was moving up into the sky. He had said he was from Venus, not the way we understand it today, but it meant that he was somehow tied in with the gods. And so Octavian thought, I need to make use of this. So he wove some stories about himself and took power, changed his name to Augustus Caesar, and then in 12 BC, when another comet came along, he had a coin struck showing himself on one side and the comet that proclaimed he was also partially divine on the other. And this showed he had all the approval of the required gods in the pantheon. Halley's Comet appeared again in history, this time giving Genghis Khan some directions. Genghis Khan had already conquered most of the known world, east and west, but as he, according to the stories, looked up into the sky, he saw a blue streak, a comet, that was pointing to the west. He took this as an indication that he was being told to go farther west in his conquering territory. He called the comet his personal star, sent his armies into Europe, and there were quite a few kingdoms there that he was able to conquer. They didn't expect him to come, so different Eastern European countries fell. And the empire was big. When he passed away, his sons took over, and they didn't govern very well. In a few years, the empire that he had built fell, but Europe kept an eye towards the east, watching for that comet because they had heard it told Genghis Khan to conquer Europe, and they wanted to make sure this comet didn't return. Interesting how it keeps coming back, even though they keep asking it not to come back. There are other comets that have made some history, but instead of continuing on comets, let's take a look at other celestial events that have caused history to change. This was not Columbus's first trip to the New World, but one of his trips, he was forced to abandon 2 of his ships. And it was what we would later call Jamaica, where he landed. Well, when he first appeared with his ships and his men and his weapons, the local people were more than happy to help him by providing supplies, food, whatever they needed. Well, after months of this, they were getting rather tired and didn't understand why they had to keep supplying these mighty people with food and supplies. So they rebelled and said, "We're done. You can get your own food, you can find your own supplies." At the time Columbus was exploring, all ships had an almanac on board, which contained tables and tables and tables of information about the planets, about stars, the constellations, the sun and the moon. And they used this for navigation, not just for interest in the night sky. When Columbus was studying the tables, he found that there was going to be a total lunar eclipse on the night of the 29th of February, 1504. And he decided he could use this to his advantage. He called one of the local chiefs up, met with him, and said, "Okay, your people are no longer supplying us with our needs. Therefore, my God is going to take vengeance on you. He is going to cause a big sign in the sky to occur to show his displeasure and what he can do to you if you don't work with me." He said that the moon would start to disappear, and then it would turn blood red and be gone forever. Well, the locals, of course, didn't believe such nonsense, but around moonrise on this date, they met with Columbus, and sure enough, in the evening, just as the moon was starting to rise, it looked like somebody had taken a bite out of it. Part of it was missing. And the part they could see kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, as long as there's a little bit of reflected light, even a sliver, a reflected sunlight from the moon, we really see just the lit part, whether it's before or after total eclipse. But during totality, all direct light from the sun is blocked by the Earth's shadow. But Earth has a thick atmosphere, and so as the sunlight comes through Earth's atmosphere, two things happen. One is dust tends to act like, well, tiny little mirrors reflecting blue light because it has very short wavelengths, and so it reflects all around the sky. It's the reason we see a blue sky in the daytime. But the red wavelengths of light are longer, and so they can get through the dust. Plus, Earth's atmosphere acts kind of like a lens and refracts or bends the light from the sun around Earth. So it's focusing a lot of red light on the moon. So when all of the bright reflected light from the sun disappears, we just see the light that's coming through at the atmosphere of Earth, and it's going to be reddish. And so sometimes our sun looks blood red, moon looks blood red. More often it's more of a coppery or orange, or maybe even a deep yellow color. But this time, it seems to have been extremely red. Well, of course, the local people were astonished that this could be done. And it showed that they were up against a great power. So they quickly agreed to supply anything Columbus and his men needed. Columbus, though, was a little coy. He said, well, I'll think about it. I'm going to take some of my men. We're going to go inside and talk to our God. We're going to think about this, and I'll let you know. He literally went back on ship, and he had basically an hourglass. He would turn, I read every half hour instead of every hour, so I guess it was a half-hour glass. But he turned it, and he waited, and he turned it again. And about 50 minutes or so after totality had started, he went back out and said, my God has agreed that he will let you have the moon back. And so it will start reappearing, and it will no longer be blood red, and things will go back to normal. However, if you break your promise to supply us with our needs, he will come again and take it away. Well, they agreed. And they supplied him with whatever he needed until the year 1504, and they were rescued by another ship coming from Europe. So in this case, he put knowledge and mathematics of what was going to happen in the sky to his own purposes. This is an intriguing meteorite. This is the meteorite over here, and it fell again in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed the ocean blue for the first time, and it landed in France. This was a big meteoroid in space, and as it came screaming through Earth's atmosphere, its surface began to sublimate. That means it's changing directly from a solid to a gas. And so there was this long plasma trail streaming out behind it. Plus, traveling faster than the speed of sound, basically what they heard, they thought was thunder, was really a sonic boom. And so they heard a huge thunderclap, and this rock landed near a village and left about 1 meter deep crater. This is not an explosive crater. This is really where it gouged out the dirt. It didn't explode. So the meteorite landed intact. Well, this caused, again, consternation because everyone knows, or knew at the time, rocks do not fall from the sky. They decided, therefore, this was a sign from God. And the Emperor Maximilian said to have interpreted this as a divine sign that he should invade France. He did. He declared war on France, won a bunch of territory they'd been disputing about for years, and decided this was important. It was called the Thunderstone because of the clap of thunder when it landed. So, wanting to make sure it didn't leave and it continued to be useful, he had it brought into the city. This was a walled city, and had it chained to the church, literally. They had a chain around it and locked it to the church to make sure it didn't leave the way it came. They didn't want it flying off into wherever it came from. Later on, when it was understood this was a meteorite, it had survived entry through Earth's atmosphere. It was like other meteorites that hit the Earth. It was moved to the local museum where it is still on display. The chain is still attached to the church showing where it was, but since meteorites are made mostly of iron, a little bit of nickel, they tend to rust. And in order to keep it from rusting away and keep all the tourists from chipping off pieces, they decided to move it into the museum. It had been getting substantially smaller year after year after year as people came by and wanted a piece of this meteorite. Constellations are a little different. They tend to be fixed, whereas eclipses take minutes in terms of a solar eclipse, or an hour or more for a lunar eclipse. Comets can be visible for several months, but they too disappear. The fixed stars that form the constellations don't change. And so, well, at least not in generations of human lifetimes. Stars were thought to be just anything in the sky was thought to be a star. Comets were named that because they were hairy stars. The word planetae meant wandering star. So basically anything in the sky was called a star. These stars, though, that didn't seem to move or do weird things were called the fixed stars. In winter, we have what's called the winter triangle. It's made of 3 stars, Procyon, Betelgeuse, and Sirius. Over here we see the famous winter constellation of Orion, the hunter. Here his knees, ankle, his belt, shoulders, and hanging from his belt is a sword. You can look at the next to the bottom star in the sword, even with the unaided eye, and tell, well, it's not really looking like the other stars. It's kind of fuzzy. That's because it's a nebula. It's a gas and dust cloud in which baby stars are forming, which is the reason it's kind of pinkish. It's not a star. Here is an outline, what I call the stick figure versions of the constellations that make up the winter triangle. Again, here's Orion. Up here is Canis Minor, and this is Canis Major. Canis, canine, dog. Major means big, minor means small. So we have the little dog and the big dog. And in mythology, Orion was a mighty hunter, and as he rises in the evening sky, he is followed by the 2 dogs that rise after him, and they follow him across the sky at night. These were his hunting dogs. They were very faithful to him, and I could go into the mythological stories, but I wanted to focus on what has really happened in history. So this is showing Orion. I do encourage you in the winter to go out and look and notice that Betelgeuse is a very different color from Rigel down here. Rigel is quite blue. Betelgeuse is an orange-red star. By the way, the Arabs are the ones that gave the stars their names for the most part because they're out in the desert areas. They had great views of the sky pretty much every night of the year. This is the reason we have no huge astronomical facilities in Tennessee. We have cloudy weather, we have rain. It's hard to always see the stars. So Betelgeuse is an Arabic name which translated means the shoulder of the giant, or in some cases, the armpit of the giant. It is one of two stars that we can see a disk in photographs, the other being our sun. So it's hard to miss in the night sky. Just look for the orange star, the blue star, the belt stars, and this is how you can find your way through the winter sky. Now, I just wanted to point out that this is from Earth. Notice that the stars that make up the constellation of Orion are not all the same distance from us. They're not really related to each other. They just happen to be along the same line of view for us. We have a tendency to look in the sky and go, oh, okay, I can make a stick figure out of this. I can connect this and make shoulders, there's a neck, belt. And so this is how we came up with the constellations. Using this constellation, find the belt stars of Orion, move downward, and you'll come to the constellation of Canis Major. Canis Major has the brightest star in the sky except for our sun. It's called Sirius. It's right here. This is not Sirius as in the English word Sirius. It's S-I-R-I-U-S, and I was told this summer by someone who speaks the language of Persia that is called Sirius. But anytime I call it that, people don't really know what I'm talking about. Now, Canis Minor only has two stars that make it up. I can't picture a little dog with the only two stars. I just see a straight line, so I call it the hot dog in the sky. But Canis Major really is one of the few constellations in which I can see an actual figure that resembles what it's supposed to. Now, Orion to me really does resemble a person holding something in his hand. But if you make Sirius the nose star, I call it, of Canis Major, then you've got this triangle showing his head, here his front legs, down here's his body and his back legs, and you can kind of see his tail coming up here, and it goes from here to here. In other words, his tail's wagging back and forth very, very quickly. So that's Canis Major. But what is this star Sirius? It's called the Scorcher, or the dog star. In late summer, late July, and most of August, we have the dog days of summer. The reason for this is Sirius at this time of year rises just before the sun, so you can see it in the morning sky before the sun is bright enough for its glare to cause all the stars to be, well, not visible to us. They're there, but we can't see them because of the glare of the sun. The Egyptians noticed this, and they also noticed that this star was rising when two things happened. One was when it was the warmest time of the year. It was hot. They thought this really bright star in the nighttime sky was adding its heat to the sun's heat, and that was what was making it so hot. And since this was known as the dog star, we have the dog days of summer, the hottest days of summer. The other thing that happened when this star was rising just before the sun was when the Nile was starting its annual flood. Now, they had to depend on the Nile. It's the only thing they really had that watered the area. And so they would know it's time to move back, the Nile's going to flood, then we can plant our crops, and we'll have something to eat since we can't grow it out in the desert. Sirius is actually two stars. One, the main one, Sirius A, that we can see with our own eyes. And then there's a tiny little companion star. It's a dwarf star, just very tiny. And it and the main star are orbiting each other. They are gravitationally connected. As stars age, they swell up. And conversely to what we think of normally, like red hot, red means hot, blue, oh, I'm turning blue because I'm cold, or ice has that kind of bluish cast to it. In physics, as you study metals that are being heated up, they first start glowing a bright orange red. Then as they heat up, they turn more orange than yellow, and something can become white hot. What is the color of the hottest part of a blowtorch? It's blue. So blue really does indicate more energy. 5,000, 10,000 years ago in ancient China and to the Egyptians, they recorded this star was orange. And what could be is that we were actually seeing what we call the small companion star Sirius B now, as it was puffing off its outer layers and dying, and those outer layers have moved away, and now we just have that little core star left over, and it is now very dim, so we can't see it, we just see Sirius A. But it is only 8.6 light years away, which for a star is very near us. The nearest star to us is 4.2 light years away. So this is just a little bit farther as stars go, and that is why it is so bright in our sky. It's close and it's big. It's 25 times more luminous than our sun. So this is Sirius A, the one that's brightest to us right now. This is the little companion star, Sirius B, that our remote ancestors might have been seeing as a big orange star. Now, to the Egyptians, they also saw something else very interesting. They saw a boat with Osiris in the boat, and he is going over the river to the afterlife. And notice we've got Sirius right up here. This was actually Sirius here. Have you ever wondered why we draw stars with points on them? Stars are spherical objects. Well, for one thing, when we look at stars through telescopes, the professional telescope used today is a reflector, and in order to hold a secondary mirror in place, so light's collected by the primary mirror, and that's bounced up to a secondary mirror, but you gotta hold it there somehow, and so there are little veins, I call them spider veins, usually 4 of them, that are holding that secondary mirror in place. And light bends around them and causes, in photographs, stars to have spikes. But for the ancient Egyptians, what they were doing was drawing all these stars on the ceilings of the tombs, especially in the pyramids. And originally they thought the Milky Way was the pathway to heaven. And so they wanted to show all these souls marching the pathway to heaven, the Milky Way. Originally they drew little people. They got tired of that, so they drew what I would call a little stick figure. And eventually they got tired of that and just started drawing this for the head and neck, here are the arms and there are the legs, showing all these little stars marching to heaven. And that, when we looked up in the ceilings and saw those, it's where we got our idea of, okay, we can just make this and we have a star in our sketch. Now again, I had talked about comets before. This is a constellation Berenices. It is in the springtime sky. We've got Leo the lion over here. And this is a very faint constellation you would probably never notice on its own. This is a cluster of stars within the constellation of Berenices. It is the only constellation in the northern hemisphere that is named for a real person who actually lived. The rest are named after mythological stories and figures. Coma, again, means hair, like comet, hairy stars. Berenices is the hair of Berenices. She lived in ancient times in probably northern Africa, Arabic areas. She was married to Ptolemy, I believe it was the third. We've got that on the next. Yep, Ptolemy the third. And in that time, kings, pharaohs went off to fight with their legions, and they would often lead the way into war. They weren't just standing back on a hilltop somewhere watching the battle. They were in there in the thick of it. Knowing that he was going into danger, she went to a local temple and promised the goddess Aphrodite that she would sacrifice her greatest beauty to the goddess if she would just bring her husband home safely. Apparently during this time, marriages were often arranged and there weren't always love matches, but this apparently was a love match. She really cared about him. She was not from this part of the world though. She was known far and wide for her long amber-colored hair, it's written. Well, a few years after he left, he returned, safe and sound, not a scratch on him. So she welcomed him and then remembered her promise and decided she had to keep her promise if she was ever going to ask the goddess for anything again. So she went to the temple, had the priest there cut off her long hair and put it on the altar. Went back, her husband saw her and hit the ceiling. "What did you do with your hair?" And she explained to him that she had sacrificed it for his safety. Well, he was not really pleased with this. So he went to the temple and threatened the priest. "My wife sacrificed her greatest beauty, for which she's known far and wide, her amber hair, to save me. I want it taken care of." Overnight, that night, the hair disappeared. I don't know why, it's not recorded in history. However, my guess is somebody thought it'd be great to have a wig that color. I don't know. Anyway, the next morning, the priest realized the hair was gone and they remembered what Pharaoh had said the night before. So they spent the day cooking up a story. That evening, when the king came to see his wife's hair, they had this. "Oh, king, the goddess was so pleased with your wife's sacrifice that she thought it was such a shame to leave it here on the altar where only a few people in the temple, including us, could see it. She wanted everyone to know how greatly your wife loved you. So they took the hair and placed it in the sky for everybody to see." Well, here it is. The hair of Berenices in the sky. And apparently the king swallowed this hook, line, and sinker and thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened. And so ever since then, this has been known as Berenices hair, Coma Berenices, and the constellation within which this cluster is contained was then named after her. And so although it is not a big constellation, it's not very bright, it does have a number of interesting objects in it, including our North Galactic Pole, lots of galaxies. When you look in this part of the sky, here's the constellation right in here. Here is the star cluster, but a lot of these other dots you see that you might think are actually stars, they're probably not. We're looking into the depths of our local supercluster. These are probably mostly galaxies, and there are lots of good ones in this part of the sky. We have a barred spiral galaxy here. We have another spiral here. M100 is a very famous spiral galaxy. It's just considered beautiful. This one we're seeing edge on, and here we have the infamous black eye galaxy because it looks like someone gave it a black eye. In the summer sky, we have more famous constellations. They are famous to our ears because they are part of the zodiacal band in the sky. This is the ecliptic, the path that the sun and therefore the moon and planets follow in the sky, because our solar system is shaped kind of like a pancake. And so whatever part of the sky the sun travels through, its entourage, meaning all the planets and their moons, follow along. So it comes through this part of the sky, Sagittarius, going through Scorpius. Sagittarius is one of those constellations that I don't get. I don't know what the Greeks were drinking when they came up with, this is a centaur holding a bow and arrow on the scorpion. Now I really can see a scorpion here. This I can see. Here is the front part of the scorpion. Here's the long tail coming down to the stinger, represented by a star named Shala. Antares, right here, trying to get it. Keep hitting the wrong one there. There it is, Antares. Think of it this way. In Greek and Roman mythology, the Greeks came up with a lot of the stories. The Romans took those stories and gave them Latin names, but it was the same story. So to the Greeks, the god of war was called Ares. But to the Romans, he was Mars. Antares is a star that is close to the ecliptic, so the sun, the moon, and the planets travel through here. And Antares is an orange star, about the same color as Mars. It's also a bright star. And every couple of years when we're really closest to Mars in our orbit around the sun, it's about the same brightness as Mars. So it's easy to look up in this part of the sky and go, oh, there's Mars. So I think in order to be funny, they come up with the name Anti-Aries, not Mars, Antares. So the name of the star is not Mars. It could also be interpreted as the rival of Mars. The Romans took what used to be a big constellation. The name of this star is Zubin el-Janamali, Zubin el-Janubi down here, and this means the northern and southern claws of the scorpion. But the Romans thought, this constellation's too big. We want 12 equal constellations, and it's too big. So they split off this part of the scorpion and made it the constellation of Libra, the scales of justice. So the scorpion lost his claws. On the other hand, people in different parts of the world that didn't have scorpions didn't see a scorpion there. In Polynesia and the different islands from Hawaii down into the South Pacific, they saw a fishhook. This was called Maui's fishhook. And the story went that the Hawaiian Islands weren't originally there. And this is sort of like the story that was told in, I think it's Moana. Is that the name of the movie? Okay, Moana. But this I heard long before the Disney movie Moana came out. Maui had a special fishhook, and he was one of many brothers, and they didn't really believe he had a magical fishhook. So he told them one day to take him out rowing in what they called a canoe. It's not the kind of canoe I'm used to. These were big ocean-going canoes. And they went out and were rowing, and he said, okay, you all cannot look. It'll break the magic, but I'm going to do something special with my magic fish hook. So he lowered his magic fish hook into the sea, and his brothers just kept on rowing, and they felt something tugging them backwards. It got hard to row. And when he said, okay, you can look now, they looked back, and there was an island. He says, okay, keep rowing. And he did this 7 more times. But the last time he did this, they couldn't stand it any longer. 1 or 2 of them turned around to look and see what he was doing. He was using his magical fish hook to reach down to the bottom of the ocean, and he was pulling the islands of Hawaii up one by one. And that's why there were 8 major Hawaiian islands, because with the 8th one, his brothers turned around and looked, and it broke the magic. And you know when you're pulling on something very strongly, like with a string, and it suddenly breaks, and the object will fly off somewhere? Well, his magic fish hook flew up into the sky, and so there it's been known as Maui's fish hook ever since. So they were using the sky to explain part of what they understood about the real world. Now, the Greeks saw something entirely different in this part of the sky. This, again, is Sagittarius. It's supposed to be a centaur holding a bow and arrow on the scorpion in the sky. The scorpion, according to their mythology, was rampaging on Earth. If you've ever seen I've forgotten the name of this movie, The Clash of the Titans, I believe, and there was a scorpion running around causing all sorts of damage. Well, it and Orion got into a major battle, and they killed each other, essentially. But in order to keep the battle from continuing to rage on in the heavens, the gods put Orion in the winter sky and the scorpion in the summer sky, so they couldn't reach each other in battle and cause any more damage. So basically, they were in timeout on opposite sides of the sky for different seasons. And then they put the centaur with the bow and arrow here, and this is the bow and arrow right in here, and it's aimed at the heart of the scorpion to make sure the scorpion doesn't cause any more trouble. I cannot see a centaur holding a bow and arrow in Sagittarius. I can see the teapot though. This is called an asterism. Here is the lid of the teapot. Here's the handle, the spout, the body of the teapot. So if you're looking for Sagittarius in the summer sky, just look for the teapot and you won't, it's pretty easy to see. You can't miss this star, Antares, and then when you see the teapot near it in the sky, you've got the centaur, the teapot, a scorpion, a fishhook, and all sorts of interesting things in the night sky, because this is the center of our galaxy. It's right above the spout of the teapot, and so the Milky Way looks like steam coming out the spout of the teapot, and this is the center of our galaxy. So again, there are things in the sky that have been used to explain what's really happening, and they needed an explanation. Or you could just find a stick figure in the sky and make up a story about it. So there are all sorts of things in the evening sky that have influenced history or we've made up stories about. So do go out and enjoy the night sky and enjoy learning about what our ancient ancestors thought about the night sky. So I'm cutting it short because I was late getting here, so thank you very much. Thank you.